Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 63. My guest in this episode is Dr. Hana Gala, and Hana is a full-time faculty member and lecturer at South Seattle College, and she's also the director of the coaching program at Leadership Associates, and her PhD was in international relations. So Dr. Gala was kind enough to sit down with me and have a nice conversation. I will say this is not necessarily an interview, it was more of a dialogue, and we gave ourselves a little bit of range to dialogue. And so if that's your thing, if that's a kind of format that you find enjoyable to listen to, then I invite you to join us. And if you were looking for more of a kind of nuts and bolts interview, this is not in that vein. So just a little heads up. And thank you so much for if you're a subscriber, being a subscriber, and for joining us for this conversation. I'd like to welcome Dr. Hana Gala to the IdeaCast interview series. I'm looking forward to a different kind of conversation today. Hana and I were talking in a pre-meet about 2 weeks ago, and we just developed a really good flow, and I think we're just going to repeat that and have a fruitful conversation. And I welcome the YouTube audience. Thank you all as well. Hana, welcome to the IdeaCast interview series.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Justin. This is great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm looking forward to our conversation. So I guess we'll start out in a very traditional way, and I will ask you to maybe share a little bit about your career and academic background to give us a little ground floor to start with, and then we'll go from there.
Well, thank you. I am currently wearing two hats. I teach hospitality management at South Seattle College. I am a professor of business management, and I have been in that role for more than a decade. I love my job, and I love my students. And I'd be happy to talk more about what that entails. And I'm also I kind of chair this role for Leadership Associates. I'm a head of their of the corporate coaching for Leadership Associates, which is a consultancy based in Vienna, Austria. So there's another story there. I'm in Seattle. We're based in Vienna, but it's a fantastic bunch of women. It's a consultancy that works primarily with women, but also corporate clients, obviously, and really focused on this topic that is very dear to my heart, which is self-discovery, leadership development. You know, leadership gets thrown around a lot, but I actually am very excited about the sort of the meaning that we ascribe to it at Leadership Associates, which is everybody is a leader, right? Like we all have skill sets that could be developed and utilized and sort of improved both in our private and professional lives. So that has been a really rewarding experience as well, because I get to participate in a community of, one of the things we do is community that meets regularly. It's a community for women primarily, but again, as I said, we also do trainings and corporate programs for companies. So obviously, men are welcome as well. And the community is very rewarding. We have done a lot of programs with UN and sort of women across the globe, and that it's always humbling and also really great sort of a reality check, because I think that I live in Seattle and I feel like sometimes that bubble is a little too bubbly, and it's always good to kind of go, oh, okay, now talking to this woman from, Africa or from India, I'm getting a very different understanding of what it means to her to be heard at work, or like what feminism means to her, or like what are the power structures and issues that they have to address. So it's been really rewarding, and I love both my hats.
I should imagine, because they both involve you creating a positive impact on people and helping them develop themselves and take more greater initiative. And when you talked about people having leadership skills within themselves, no matter where they are in a hierarchy of corporate or business structure, I thought of, there was a woman who wrote a book called the Scout Mindset. And so you could have a soldier mindset or a scout mindset. Well, it's good to think, I guess, that you could have a scout mindset, even if you're within a big corporation, to be able to manage yourself and then not have to be as managed top down. So I like that idea that you're talking about that. And then another thought I had just to, with regard to getting a little more international flavor in your perspective is when I mentioned to you, I was at my botanical garden today, and I thought, botanical gardens are so designed on a Western framework and like a European framework, and that was imported to America. And I'm like, that would be an interesting anthropologic research project, is to find out what other botanical parks have been designed pre-colonialism or just absent of Western or European influence. So anyway, I'm on a tangent, but it's what came to mind when you mentioned being open to diversity and celebrating that.
And I am not a botanist, I will start by saying my understanding of botanical gardens is super limited. And yet I will tell you that I think that it's actually, there is a connection that I can see to something that we discussed earlier before we started rolling, that the sort of in terms of self-mastery or in terms of knowing the world, the connection to nature is actually much stronger outside of the Western world, right? So when you look at, we have one of the most beautiful places in Seattle area is our Kubota Gardens. That's a Japanese design sort of space. And we have a beautiful Chinese garden just not far from my house. And so I think that actually there's a lot that we can learn, and these sort of almost like churches or shrines to the nature exist in all cultures.
Yeah.
It's just that in our culture, which is Judeo-Christian Western culture, that's our bubble, we are so removed from something we discussed before, which is other ways of knowing, right? Like we have this obsession of, and I was talking to somebody else about this on some other podcast, like this, Descartes and probably, St. Augustine's and Descartes in particular, but also Hegel, completely like pushing all of this. As a culture, we're just pushed so into the prefrontal cortex. And unless I can explain this, and unless I can, quantify it, it's not happening. And it's like, you can quantify love, and yet we all know it's here. I can sense it, I can feel it. So, what are you saying? And so I think that that's really interesting as we're struggling with the current, very real issues. We're sort of in this free fall of not having something to hold on to because our world is so disjointed at this point.
Yeah. No, I think you strike an important note there, that we've bifurcated nature and our species, which is still deeply embedded in nature, whether we like it or not, and natural disasters remind us of that. So I kind of can answer my own question that there's no need for botanical gardens in many cultures because they're at one with nature already. And so what's the point, right? Yeah, we're the ones that sort of put them into compartmentalized situations, which is fine, because if you're in an urban environment, regardless of where you are on the planet, it's good to have sanctuary. So in Singapore, in Kuala Lumpur, there's parks. They're absolutely amazing, and some of them are even enclosed because it's 93 degrees all year long. And even in Sri Lanka, there's a beautiful. I just see all this on YouTube mostly, but there's just some absolutely gorgeous gardens. So I guess in the context of urban versus pastoral or rural environments, bucolic environments, that would make sense, that there's no need for containing things, that they're there already at your disposal and you're already embedded with it.
Yes, and I think that there is value in the preserving, but also making it a thing. Like we again, that's why I was saying it's almost like a shrine or
Mm-hmm.
a an altar to, you know, a very intentional recognition of what the nature is to us, even in an urban environment, or, you
Mm-hmm.
know, like people, I love the craze. It's like there are people who actually went through the pandemic. I always joke about the fact that I went through the pandemic, the only person who didn't learn how to bake bread. Um,
Yeah.
and I also didn't buy an Instapot, you know, but I love how everybody, at least in this part of the world, started um making their own like in-home gardens, and
Mm.
the revival of plants and like indoor plants.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole subculture, there's like a whole sub-civilization of indoor plants,
Yeah.
people living somewhere in, you know, I know they're on Instagram, and I know that they are on TikTok and all these other, you know, platforms, that I don't necessarily follow, but I am aware of them, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so I think my fascination, I'm not a professional in this necessarily, but is with how we respond to the zeitgeist, or like what's happening
Mm-hmm.
and what comes out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's really interesting, uh like, what is it about the plants? And you're like, well, the parks were closed and people craved
Mm-hmm.
some greenery, right? Like,
Right.
and also taking care of something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's really powerful when you think about it. It's like, oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
why plants?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think being in isolation, it it brings something out of you that you want to keep busy, but then in isolation, perhaps there's more appreciation for doing something productive. You know, you could scroll away and spend time on all the social media sites, but to care and tend to a plant or a series of plants, you know, makes sense that that's a form of connecting with something that you can control and that responds not quite like a pet or a child would, but there's life there, and so yeah, that makes sense. And there's a channel on. You can tell I'm a YouTube junkie. Her name is Summer Rain Oaks, and she's super popular, but that's all she does is interior scapes. And it's a really neat channel. And I think her popularity probably ballooned during those 2 years when everybody was kind of hunkered down and not necessarily able to go to the parks or go out into nature. They brought nature into them, so that makes sense. It makes sense.
You know, I will bring something that I've never talked about much about this publicly, but so I was born in Czechoslovakia in the mid 70s, and
Oh, okay.
so I grew up in the communist country, and we couldn't travel. We couldn't, you know, like first time I was on the plane was when I was 17. Like my child has traveled more by the time he was 5 years old than I have by the time I was, you know, 20. Regardless. So we the to own a house or to own, you know, and to own your own business was impossible. You couldn't actually have a private business, but everything was state owned. And but there was a tradition. Czechs, and you know, we're always very, it's a very interesting culture where there was this connection to tourism, which in our context meant hiking and
Mm-hmm.
just being outdoorsy. And it started very early on, sort of kind of like a scouts movement.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this idea that in the healthy body, healthy spirit. And so from like the 20s and early, you know, 20th century, people would be going on hikes, and you know, cross country is big, and it's like this connection to the nature was actually pretty big, even though it's a fairly urbanized country. And when the communists got to power in 1948 over the putsch, the people kind of started this. There was this hunger for summer houses, or there were these garden colonies, and a really big part of your life was having a cabin, sort of this cabin life in a very different context, right? Like when I see on Instagram people go cabin life hashtags, and it's like all these cute, and it's like, okay, you live in Oregon, but okay, fine. But for me, my family did have a cabin that no indoor plumbing, right? There's an outhouse, and it's in the highlands, but that's where I saw how most men kind of found their the way to self-realize by rebuilding, remodeling, kind of working slowly or in teams. I remember my dad and his buddies, they would kind of like tag, where one weekend you spend helping your friend doing this, and then the next weekend they help you with something else, and at your cabin. And we didn't have a car. We would take a train, but every weekend you would go, and every summer you would spend there, and every winter you would spend there. And it was such an escape. And I think that it was, again, anthropologically speaking, or social, sort of from the perspective of social psychology, the reason why people were able to take the abuse from the system, but also like not go freaking insane, and the suicide rate wasn't higher, was because there was an outlet, right? Like, I don't know if somebody can argue that's why it lasted longer than it would have, and or if it's like, thank God, at least there was something. But to have people go, I'm looking at people in their mid life, like all my friends, we are sort of at that point, and I'm thinking, if we like, how abusive, horrible, and unconscionable to take away this ability to be creative, this ability to build, this ability to self-realize, which is what we had, right? Like you couldn't. And in like, I don't want to lose myself in this nostalgia, but my point was, during the pandemic, a lot of people recognized how debilitating and horrible it would be, and it was, to have that, kind of taken away. And it's one thing to have your home and have a little garden and going on with, like, making your little side projects and entertaining the kids and, supplying sort of supplementing the schools, et cetera, et cetera. Like, it's not that people were not busy. But when you are in New York and you have a 1-bedroom apartment or 2-bedroom apartment, and you have 2 kids, and you're enclosed and you're trapped. I have a friend who lives in Amsterdam. She's actually was a colleague at Leadership Associates, and like, they had curfews. You couldn't leave the house, and there was police, and they were checking if you're on the street because you go shopping, or because it's such a densely populated area. And it sounds so unfathomable, and yet you see what damage it's doing to the psyche, right? And so I guess what I was saying, where I'm going with this, is I always felt this connection to nature because we had to, or because I was always exposed to it. But I also think that there's this the need to be creative and to self-realize. And when you take that away, it's like, my students know this. I always say, well, it's the toothpaste principle. You keep pushing on one end, it's going to come out on the other. Like, it's not a rocket science. And I think that what we're seeing here is a lot of this pent up sort of anger and anxiety, that there was a reason maybe, and now everybody's like really mad.
Yeah. Well, it's justifiable, because we're moving along at our pace in 2019. For decades, especially here in the West, in the United States, we're used, I don't want to say spoiled, but we're very used to being free and flowing and being able to do anything we want. And then all of a sudden this thing comes along, and you see a sort of, you can judge it now with hindsight being what it is, whether it was a reaction or an overreaction. But the bottom line is a lot of people had their lives challenged and upended to some degree. And, they are largely first world problems. I always joke, it's like, well, I didn't get macheted to death this morning, and so it's a good day, so I try to, put myself in the position of somebody living in South Sudan or something. So I always relativize it, but it's still, nonetheless, you're going from being able to do as you please to suddenly there's a lot of restrictions being put on you. So I get the anger. I completely understand why people would be upset. But then again, that's an opportunity to learn to put things into perspective, to understand that this was an experiment of sorts, because it's only been a century since the last, anything close to what we dealt with, the Spanish flu. And so, yeah, nobody's alive. It's all a priori. In other words, everything is just, let's try to figure it out as we go. And we can certainly armchair everything that we went through. But, I just kind of write it off as an opportunity to take a stressor and adapt from it. So that's anti-fragility, I guess, is what I'm inferencing there, or referencing rather. So it's each person, I think, has to digest it in their own way. And I completely understand if people are resentful of the time lost or time taken, especially younger people. Like, you teach students, and it's a different environment. I went through this in my 50s. I didn't go through it in my 20s. So I can't speak for anybody but myself, or perhaps my immediate friends and family. So yeah, it's something I guess we all have to kind of sort out. But I would advocate that we do it in the way that's best to understand what if there is another scenario, and I suspect there will be, with another outbreak of something, that we understand how we can manage it better. I mean, that's the best you can do, right? You learn from what was done in the past cycle, and I don't know.
I am not questioning, and I don't necessarily think that we need to spend more time talking about the pandemic since we started, appreciating nature and indoor plants. But my point would be, I agree. Every morning I wake up and I'm a big fan of Stoics, as you can see. Marcus Aurelius is very prominent right here. But the Memento Mori is real, and I think that it's a great thing to remember. That we have a saying with my neighbors here: every morning when we see each other, or every now and then, we are like, we were spared, right? Like, there's the millions of people who died, and you are incredibly lucky. You earned none of this, like being born in a country where I was allowed to go to school, where I didn't get mutilated as a little girl, the safety. I was thinking about this a few years ago. I was home alone, and I thought, I'm a woman who's here alone with my child, and I have zero worries. How lucky is that? And I live in a city with, close, like, millions of strangers, and I am safe. That's, that is something to really, like, ponder every now and then. Yeah. So that's all true. And at the same time, I think that what is really interesting is how I've been sensing this sort of a global unrest, and particularly in the US, but like, there's this confluence of deeply complex issues and situations and factors, and we're so not prepared to deal with them, right? To deal with any of them. So, being a teenager is always a shit show. Like, everything is terrible. Yeah. Or like unknown, right? Like, there's so much unknown. Yeah. And yet, you can deal with it, or we all have throughout millennia, certain way. But then you introduce the social media into that already complex process, and it takes it, like, it's like injecting steroids into a puppy, right? Like, it's just insane.
Mm-hmm.
And adding layers of difficulty that your parents cannot even fathom, let alone know how to solve, right? Like there's so many events that now we don't even know where it's going. And so that's one. And then you have the pandemic and you're like, okay, that's bad. And it's never happened on this scale. But we also never had a economic system so intertwined as we do now, right? Like the whole, people are like, what is the chain? What are you talking about? The containers with my stuff are stuck. They didn't ship from China. What is like the supply chain? What is like, I never had to think about it, and now I do.
Yeah.
And so there's all these issues, and now with AI, I think I'm sensing this bubbling, right under surface. People are like, what the F is going to happen? Right? Like, it's so troublesome. It's so troublesome.
Yeah.
I thought about this yesterday, and about how when internet started, like, I think I was in, like, I remember getting computers in, and like knowing, being aware of internet and using it when I was in college. But then it didn't seem like everything's going to change dramatically. And it probably had for a lot of people whose jobs were altered, et cetera, et cetera. I just didn't pay attention to it. And I'm wondering if the kids these days, pay attention to the AI, but I'm pretty sure they do. I'm terrified, and I'm also I'm excited because I've been following what's happening, and at the same time, I think that there's a huge qualitative difference, and because, again, more sort of aligned with the topics that you usually discuss on this podcast, existentially, I think we're worried and like perplexed and worried, and that's because I think those in the know have pretty good idea that this could go very wrong for humanity.
Yeah.
And we've been seeing it more and more. The day we're, recording, just this morning, there was a story about, how Bing was like, I don't want to talk to you, go away. I think I want, like the AI is talking back in a way that it's extremely rude and extremely unacceptable if it was a person. But what do you do with a, misbehaving car or misbehaving AI? And it's a whole ethical issue. Anyway, so my point is, there are these global issues and very deeply personal issues. And the pandemic kind of exacerbated a lot of issues and topics that were already there, like your government can do A, B, or C, and you don't really have a recourse. And that has been always the case, and most people operated under this idea that, but they mean well, right? Like they are voted, elected. It's pretty much for the greater good. I think that a lot more people are now like, is this true? Is this, and how do we, and now with like the artificial intelligence, it gets even more messy.
Yeah.
And so bringing it back to what your podcast is about, and what I see also, I think that people are a little lost because they are lacking meaning in their lives. And we have this like a post existential crisis of meaning, as John Vervaeke talks about the meaning crisis. And I think it's very real. I see it every day, and I am not sure we have a good way out. I don't know if his suggestion of let's do cognitive science is like, I don't know if that's the answer for everybody.
Yeah, and he tries to ground it in the Neoplatonist tradition, where there is some signifier, signified, and symbolic meaning, and as you know, we were talking about different types of knowing, that there is beyond the propositional tyranny, which is what I would say AI could ultimately far surpass the worst of us sociopaths in this world when it comes to these kind of things. But I think the spirit of what he and his colleagues and people who associate with him, I think, and you know, it has to be a broader, what's the Buddhist interdependence, you know, like, so nothing is individual, everything has to be understood as relational. And I think if we can gather a sense of understanding that power, that, and then transcend I don't blame anybody, the predilection to be upset, fearful, feeling like you're in a nihilistic or even solipsistic environment. Because like you said, with AI, and I'm concerned myself, because I think what's happened in the last 30 years, like you said, with the internet emerging, is we haven't stopped at plateaus. Like if you're ascending Mount Everest, you have to get used to certain altitudes. And so I'm drawing that analogy to say that, you know, our technotopian Silicon Valley types are it's just blazing trail, you know, devil may care, kind of just going. Like, I don't know if that's seeking a type of religiosity or something, or they're trying to find some transcendence, but it's like the rest of us need to assimilate. Like, we have to assimilate social media and understand the shadows of the shadowy part of social media. And then maybe we can get into computer-human relationships, which we have to be very careful, because we're so quick to attach and project in certain ways. I mean, you were speaking of social psychology earlier. Think of the mess that could come from people who develop relationships with ones and zeros, algorithms, essentially, which eventually will turn into qubits. I hope not anytime soon, because when quantum computing meets artificial intelligence, it'll be the simulacra of the simulacra. You know, it's like just layers of abstraction away from what you and I are doing. We're connecting, even though we're doing it through the internet. So to wind my part down, I would say that it seems like, yes, the meaning crisis, and then also the tempering or the governing mechanism we have to discover. And that's difficult, because there's such a siren song of what technology does. Everybody wants the latest iPhone. Everybody wants to get with ChatGPT or the other competitors' model, I can't remember. But any of these things that are coming out, we want it, because I think we're also following that same, whatever it is that the tech people are following, you know, that desire to transcend and get beyond ourselves, get beyond the treachery, I guess, of being, whatever it is we find ourselves in the modern world. I'll let you go.
I think that's the key. No, but I think that's the key. Like what you just said is, we can't stop that progress, because we essentially have been conditioned, again, by the Industrial Revolution and the loss of religion and the loss of uniting organizing principle. We don't have that organizing principle that would be uniting us all, right? Like we don't have that. And in the absence of that organizing principle, we have been fed the idea that, again, the knowing of the world is only possible through our prefrontal cortex and through science, and what is measurable and what is quantifiable and what is, replicable. And it's wonderful in many contexts, but it's not the uniting, unifying principle. And the problem is that I think all the people, not the old people, obviously, but like the Silicon Valley or people who work on AI are almost hungry for that answer. Like, what is the answer? Like, the more we know about the world, the more we know about how things work, the sooner we discover the answer to everything. And I believe that's misguided in the sense that there is not one answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
And number two, it's also very natural, and in a way, it's this dichotomy of, it's beautiful to watch humans just like run at full throttle into their own demise because they want to find the answer, and they're like, we are so readily cutting the branch we're sitting on, right? Like by introducing social media to kids, by, like, but it's so fun. It connects people. Yeah, it does. It also gives rise to all these other not so good phenomena. And same with the AI. So I feel like it's interesting to look at this, and I understand what you're saying with the base camps and kind of going slowly, and at the same time the beauty and terrifying aspect of humanity is like, we don't take breaks, we don't stop and ponder, we don't consider, like there's this hunger, and it's led by good intentions. Like, we want to know more, we want to, like, if there is something to be discovered, humans want to discover it. I like the idea that, who said it, the first person climbing the mountain, who said, well, it was there.
Yeah.
Why did you do? Well, because it was there. Like, I want to climb that mountain because it's here.
Yeah.
I want to know more.
Yeah. We can't fight that nature. And, again, with the Enlightenment project, we went to strong empiricism versus faith, and trusting fatherly authority, patriarchal authority, or whatever. And to understand things from a more logical positivist perspective, where we want the absolute empirical, truth and so forth. But as I think you pointed out, quantitative information is not something that enriches our lives necessarily. It can produce things and ideas that can supplement and, I think, enrich, maybe through one layer of separation. I don't know what that looks like. I don't have the mind for that. But what I would think, though, is that if we get too far lost into that maze, that we are, I think, having a hard time finding our, I'll use the word very loosely, the ensoulment of who we are. And so for me, ensoulment is what you and I are doing. We're thinking, and we're having a conversation. To me, I think, like the old psyche, like the old definition of psyche, is torn in different directions. So there is the qualitative essence of life there, but there's also the ones and the zeros and the quantitative essence of life. And that integration, as you said, there's so many different perspectives. There's an old saying that there's as many recipes for kimchi as there are Korean grandmothers. So it's like, when we think about, well, what is spirituality, and what is grounding ourselves, and what is the qualitative raison d'etre, so that's a hard one to sort out. What I tend to do for myself is I practice what I call doxastic humility, like a belief humility. And I'm a skeptic, so I always just leave things open-ended. I'm not a Richard Dawkins skeptic. I'm more of the Pyrrhonian, ancient, Sextus Empiricus kind of thing, where it's like epoche leads to ataraxia. Like, I just let go. I loosen my apprehension of things, and I'll hold information loosely and just move forward with that, but without really landing hard on anything. For me as a citizen, now, I'm not an academic. I'm not anybody who's going to have any influence on people in that sense. So it's safe for me to do that. But I understand that others have to put forward ideas and philosophical propositions. So it's a tough one. It's a tough nut to crack, as they say. Trying to figure out how we integrate what we were as pre-18th century persons to what we've pulled out of the cauldron, or what we've wrought for ourselves, I think, which is information and technology and science. And one thing I'll say for science is it's excellent for technology, but it comes up short in being able to mirror to us again what that ensoulment is, what that diverse aspect of intelligence is in the psyche. It's almost as though our sentience and our sapience, I don't want to use sapience, our cognitive horsepower has become maladaptive in a sense until we can reframe and readjust. Maybe I'll say it that way. Like introspective.
Well, it is.
Yeah. At this point, it's becoming very maladaptive. What do you think of that? I mean, I'll throw that out as a proposal. I'm not saying it as a declarative statement. It's just a thought.
If I think it has, and it's also it's always been inadequate, but now we understand way more why based on neuroscience, and also we see how it's not working, right? Mm-hmm. So there is, pile of evidence, and we also know how why that is. But I might take it to sort of this arena of leadership where it might be more tangible. And again, I sometimes feel like these podcasts are a little, they're very sort of esoteric and ideas, and I love figuring out things in this Socratic dialogue, and I love that. It's great. But I also, my strength is taking these big ideas and just explain to my students what does that mean, right? So I will tell you that, explaining them Plato and the parable of the cave is much easier when you can say, have you seen Matrix? And this is what Matrix is about, or, like kind of bringing it down.
Right.
So to your point, I see it in the world of leadership where, or like how we manage our companies and organizations, where for decades, this obsession with Six Sigma and all the process improvement, processes, and Jack Welch being the sort of the god of process improvement and efficiency, right? Like how to be efficient. And you have the thousands and thousands of CEOs and managers, low level, mid level, high level, being kind of in this cookie cutter. All the departments do it the same way. All the people, kind of follow the same procedures. And as we centralize and we, follow the simplified or then, fiat and more complicated structures and processes, the better, the more saving, et cetera. And it doesn't work because, A, because we're human, and B, because it's just dumb. Because we are humans, and as such, we are complex, which is why Dave Snowden and all the ideas of complexity and systems that are complex need other ways and other tools how to manage, right? Like how to be successful in kind of probing and sensing, and even in daily lives, that you can't just like go with, okay, these are the facts, and this, because we all have our own internal interpretation. We're coming in with different biases. We have different ideas, and even language fails us, right? Like that's one of the things that I find is especially troubling, that we now are at the point where we don't agree on the meaning of many words, during the intro, I used the term feminist, and I was like, oh shit, like this is gonna come back and bite me, because I don't know how people think, this is like, we are currently in the US debating what's a woman. Like, I don't have time for this nonsense. Like, I just, but then that's the reality. So we have to, that's troubling. So in the world of organizations, people are now struggling because the past models, the Six Sigma, and like everybody does what we are saying, and you go in the meeting and you have the outcomes and you want to, but ultimately it's much more relational. You have to kind of work with people, and And for that, a lot of people don't have the tools. And that's what I see with our clients, where you're like, you say it's about, one example would be, I had a very successful architect who was saying, well, I have a very hard time in big meetings and she was like, well, I think it could be because I'm a woman and they don't respect me. And then she said, well, maybe it's because of my English, because she was not a native speaker. And ultimately, she's like, oh, after we kind of like worked, we kind of peeled it off. And she's like, well, I worry about being successful and I want to be successful and I stress myself. And, like I have this anxiety going in. And only when you like work with people kind of discovering what those issues are, and sometimes they're internal and sometimes it is the organization, but only then you can go, okay, so now we can pivot. And it's not about you. It's about defending the client's needs. And that's your job. Like you're arguing, you're advocating for your clients. That's where that's the position. And once you are able to kind of align that and remove the ego and recognize that that was really what was stressing you out, but my point is, you need somebody who gives you these tools, and we are horrible in equipping people with the right tools. And there's so many organizations that say, oh, we're in leadership development, or we're doing, trainings, and we are coaching, and they're not, there are all these, I almost wrote about this recently. It's like, be human-centered. That's my favorite. Be human-centered, improve your communication. I'm like, that's all garbage. If people, because what does that mean, right? Like you need to be more proactive and practical. Like you need to give people tools, like what questions to ask, how to look inside, what is the self-mastery for you? Because it can be different than it is for Joe or, Shwama here. Like they all have different. So I think that you are right that we are sort of the obsession with science and cognition and kind of quantifiable approaches is very deeply embedded. And I can also tell you that from my experience as a coach, there's a very high level of distrust to anything that it's not science-based. So it's an interesting sort of angle where we have to go in and we have to open with science, and we have to like argue how what we're doing is actually tied to science and how our bodies, like I'm a big fan of neurobiology, and I would always, speaking first about how the neurons respond, how your amygdala responds, how your, like nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, responds. And then you can take it to emotions and self-regulation and how to even recognize your emotions. We're like shitty in recognizing our own emotions, and I'm not different, right? Like I
do the same thing.
We don't teach kids. We do. We're doing much better. I'm actually very hopeful for Gen Z in that respect, because again, side note from real life, I remember being in my son's school, elementary school, and they had these like the charts, like mood meters, they call them. And so they can tell if you're like, are you yellow? Are you red? Are you yellow? Are you green? Like, like where are you on this? I never knew this is a thing. Like I went through my whole school life and or family life and never had the idea that there's a spectrum, right? For anything. So we're doing good or better. We're doing better, I think, in like teaching people some tools. And I think I see it even with my both kids, but also like students, they are better in stating their needs or articulating how they're feeling. And I think that's a great start. Like that gives me a lot of hope. I mean, it's also going to be much worse for them, the world that we're leaving.
Yeah, and that goes right back to, where are we going with technology, and are we being mindful of the impact, the waves that are coming, the wake of waves that are coming out from this spearhead that's going, like you said, like a freight train, just barreling through without much input from or meta-analysis from the disciplines. If we want to stay within the house of science, what is psychology saying about this? What are sociologists saying about the impact of the last 25 or 30 years of this experiment of taking people, you and I are close in age, who were pre-internet, I'm pre-computer. I mean, they came on when I was in junior high, and they were very primitive, and in the early 80s. But I do recall a time before computers. And so there was television, of course, and newspapers and radio, but it was a different kind of assimilation process, and it was a different kind of communication process. And now things are so immediate and so expanded. We love to think we're individualists, but nonetheless, we are so deeply connected to whatever your flavor of, media is or information gathering is. That has exploded. I mean, it's just gotten, so wide open, and that I think has to. And like you said, we're not good at that kind of management. I don't think, emotional regulation, self-awareness, and the self-deception that can sneak into the trying to discover self-awareness. For adults, I think that might be the area of focus, is to find a way to unpack yourself in a healthy way with the right people who don't have motives to just take your money and feed you a bunch of BS about whatever it is that their method is, and learn to recognize. My thing that I do is, it's like, well, there's your persona, there's a character you play, but then there's a core essence of who you are. And in that core essence is all the ages you've ever been. It's all the good and bad that you've ever introjected into your system. And you have to try your best, again, with maybe somebody who's qualified to do these kind of things, to be aware of what that map looks like, and then understand, how are you mapping your personality or your persona that you project out into the world on a daily basis, like all of us do. Is there a mapping system there that can be presented to people in a way that can be done without too much strain on us, in an already stressful life and world? So maybe that's one way to look at it. And then also recognize the connectivity that we have, going back to that, and just appreciating that, no matter how much you think you're an individualist, you are bound. Unless you can make your own clothing, you can manufacture your own transport, medicine, and you lived on 200 acres in Montana somewhere. And there are people like that, and, hats off to you. But the rest of us, we're tied in, and we're deeply, and that's the thing that scares me more than anything, is we don't realize that if there were a collapse in the so-called Western world, where we're all the techno world, or whatever you want to call us, that it will not be pleasant. It will not be good. And so we have to figure out, if the system is not sustainable, and the system is not correctable to the most ideal degree, then how do we come in for a soft landing? How do we land this thing, or bring it to an altitude, or whatever analogy you want to use, to not have a horrific rather, disaster on our hands, as far as whatever it is that might, like you said, when Gen Z is our age, in our age range, and their children are coming up. That's what concerns me, is how to, and that brings us back into people like Dave Snowden and John Vervaeke and a bunch of was it Daniel Smachtenberger's always talking about consilience and things like that, and a bunch of those guys are out there trying to work on it. But even a lot of that's inaccessible, because there's a lot of deep thoughts and big words and multisyllabic ideas being batted about. It's an interesting maze to work ourselves out of. Yeah, I'll let you start. not something because you know, I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
I don't have an answer. I would love to have an answer, but I don't.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I am optimistic, and I'm realizing that that's a state of mind that also very few people don't have, right? So earlier you were talking about we need some sort of a belief, right? We are just programmed to have some belief, and whether that's, you know, if somebody says I'm an atheist, then I don't, even that is a belief, right?
Yeah.
And maybe you believe that everything is explained, like explicable by science, is like whatever, but the interesting thing that or the alarming thing for me is when I realize that my baseline is essentially I don't have all the answers. Actually, I know I have very few answers, and yet I have this sort of openness and belief. It's a faith almost, right? It's a belief that ultimately things will be what they will be, and I will be okay. And this is a deeply seated calm that comes with, you know, a lot of practices and age and personal experiences, and it's sort of a place where you ideally arrive sooner rather than later in your life. But I'm also very cognizant of the fact that not everybody has that. And there's a lot of people older than me who don't have that internal peace. A lot of people of faith have that peace embedded. And it's a beautiful, you know, spot to be.
Yeah.
It's a blessing, no pun intended. And yet not everybody has this experience. And I think that honestly, that's terrifying. Terrifying, right? Like, it's just scary. And it's also how a lot of people in this world operate, because again, we don't have that unifying, organizing principle. And I think that existential crisis that a lot of people have is partially because we all long to have some sort of calm, or some sort of almost self-assurance that it gives you safety, right? Or some sort of security to know that things will work out. And how do you know, or how do you, and again, that's where the practical sort of tangible things come in. So we talked about different ways of knowing, and if you believe that you can only know what you can explain and know by reading or language, it's like, if I tell you how a gelato, you know, tastes, I can use a lot of words and you still wouldn't know the taste, right? And or it's going to be very different from walking down the cobblestone street in Italy and having a cone with gelato in your hand at sunset, which is just like, I can't even put it in my words. And so there are all these techniques, psychosomatic and or other, you know, ways to kind of lean into other ways of knowing, which I think are really important. And, you know, there's this kind of surge of mindfulness trainings, and people are way more into mindfulness. And honestly, like, I think that's great. Fantastic, more power to you if you know, if that is what works for you. There is more sort of this pull towards the sort of transcendent experiences, or, you know, through drugs. but not in like, ayahuasca or having sort of this more of a LSD, sort of the heightened reality, sort of this, and all the, and I'm a big fan of sort of, I don't have any personal experience with it, but I'm very excited about all the research and the latest data showing huge progress in terms of like how we can treat PTSD. And it seems to be very with psychedelics, and I think that that's a very hopeful kind of progress. But why? Because it gives you it's that perspectile knowing, right? Like it shifts your perspective.
Yeah.
And I think, art is one of the most underrated ways we can get there.
Yeah.
Maya Angelou, apparently as a young dancer, had this transcendent experience herself while dancing. She talked about it eventually in her somewhere. And I remember, talking to a person who had very rigid, sort of disassociated from her body life for decades. And then she did yoga. And say what you want about yoga. And again, like I'm not in any way, shape or form critical, or I can see, people going, well, but it lacks the spiritual, and some people probably do it as a workout, but that's beside the point. This particular woman, was talking about the camel pose, which is when you're basically kneeling and you have to stick your groin essentially into the world, and it's like deeply uncomfortable for people who are guarded and who are like disassociated from their bodies. And it took her like 2 years to be comfortable, sort of to like open herself up to the world, literally with, like the pelvis needs to be pushed forward.
Yeah.
And, but that kind of like, she had to sit for years with this, or months and months of the practice with this, like, why is this uncomfortable? Why am I afraid? Why is it that I find this, like, of all the poses, this one is the most uncomfortable? Why is it? And I think, kind of this is going back to what we discussed, like all the ways that we or like me as a coach or schools and society can, like, people can tap into ways that work for them. And to see somebody, not through psychedelics, not through music, not through dance, but she found it in yoga, right? Like it worked for her. I know several people who I worked with who discovered martial art, and through martial arts, they were able to tap into their own sort of self-discovery. And I think it's not for, like, I'm very upset when people say, well, this is such a first world problem. It's not, it's everybody's. We have been, unlike other societies and cultures, much more rigid and kind of removing ourselves from this way of knowing the world. And it is a different way of knowing the world. It's a different way of knowing yourself. And if I may, I know we might be looking at the time, but like the one thing that I think is really, really, I'm very passionate about this, is the self-discovery is so critical, because it's only through the self-discovery that we can connect with the other person, right? Nobody is only good. Nobody is only bad either, right? But understanding your own demons and your own weak spots makes it possible to connect with other people and have compassion with them when they mess up. And I think the biggest disservice we have done to ourselves as a society through social media is limiting the ways in which we can connect. Like you and I have this beautiful conversation that lasts, a long time. So we can really peel it off and go layer by layer and cover a lot. But when you have a 140, science tweet and or it's a small post on Instagram on like it's taken out of context. This is, and we are so good at ad hominem attacks.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like both can be true. You can have this fantastic idea, and then you can have this shitty idea, and you can be a very, successful person and think something that is not great.
Mm-hmm.
And you can learn, and then later you can say, you know what, I learned and I no longer think that.
Yeah.
And we have a hard time with acknowledging complexity in each other because we have a hard time acknowledging complexity in ourselves. And then we have very hard time acknowledging growth in others. Like, yes, you held this idea or this opinion and you wrote about it or you said it 10 years ago and you no longer think that. Okay, instead of going, good for you, there's growth, there's progress.
Yeah.
We're like, no, we're going to take you down because 10 years ago you had this idea that is no longer acceptable.
Yeah.
It's like, I find it so, as an educator, that just drives me bonkers.
Well, and that to me is sort of a barometer or indicator of the intention behind that kind of thinking. And that to me is coming from either narcissism or trauma or sociopathy or dark vulnerable triad behavior traits. And I'm not somebody who can analyze anybody in that sense, but I'm casually aware of these. I was raised by a covert narcissist, so I know to some degree. And so when people do that and they take on this piety, this righteousness that, you cannot be absolved and there is no contrition and yada, yada, yada for what you did 10 years ago. Now, there are circumstances, like if somebody mowed down a bunch of people and, did horrible things, then maybe they do have to live with that for the rest of their lives. But if somebody said something because they were not intellectually mature or mentally, emotionally mature enough to really see a broader spectrum, and they said something that was insensitive, and like you said, they demonstrably indicated their change and their ascension from that. Like you said, that needs to be taken in. And maybe if you feel like being redundant and saying, well, they were a bad person then, and it's like, well, everybody knows this is not rocket science here, but they're here now and they're trying to do some good. They're trying to redeem themselves. I mean, if you're going to be this pious, righteous creature, you have to understand the Abrahamic narrative that there is the fall, there is the absolution, and there's the contrition and all the rights that come with that, and then you are absolved by whomever, and then you move on. And yeah, so I agree. We can't operate like that. But like I said, I think the motives there. Again, it's narcissism or it's self-righteous self-gratification is probably a friendly way to say it. They're on the social media platforms digging for dopamine or whatever you want to call it.
And there's two levels to it, right? So when I teach, I always tell my students the number one rule is apply the grace principle. Assume good intentions.
Mm-hmm.
Assume good, like you may be proven wrong, but assume that you don't know where they're going with what they're saying. Assume that, they mean well. Like that's the grace principle. That's the, assuming that we are communicating in good faith.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one. But then the second part to it is, I think we are kind of the inner individual. This is why it's so interesting, because the individual relations and individual conversations are also sort of molded and happening in very sort of a tangible system that we created that is very inconducive, or what's the word I'm looking for, to this good faith principle. Because like social media runs on likes. If you and not only so our media, right? So if you know that your currency is clicks, if the currency is clicks, and if you know that as humans, and again evolutionary, we are we are wired to be biased towards bad news, right? Because that's more important for our survival. It all makes sense.
Yeah, hijacks the amygdala. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, and that's what we want. We want the amygdala to be hijacked all the time, right? If I'm a media
you want to sell
mogul,
commercials, you need to have people's attention. Yeah.
and I want them to be passionate about it. So to say the horrible thing first, and then, bury in the lead, like bury that it actually did not happen, it's like that's what gives you the clicks. So we have this dual situation where you have a communication between two people or between several people, but it's also happening in the arena that it's deeply skewed. It's just it's not real, right? And it's skewed towards the sort of the currency that it's the likes, meaning you have more negative and you gain more attention by being negative than the other way around.
Yeah.
And so it's almost this race to get your word in and to kind of destroy the other person, because that gives you, and on campuses, this is really terrifying, because the students now know that they can be more popular by being antagonistic. And, not in my classroom. I got to say I have the best students, and I want to acknowledge that really they're just the best people.
Awesome.
And like one-on-one that never, or like in the classroom setting, I'd never ever, have these issues, but I do realize that it's a problem because the environment is molding you a certain way. And it's, if I may, some time ago, I was on a podcast. Somebody asked me, because in my past life, I also so I come from a hotel industry, and I started with earning my PhD in international relations, and I spent a lot of years studying Plato and ethics, and I have to say I still built on that, and it's a huge advantage to have this classical education, and I'm very grateful for that. It really helps me to see the world in a certain way. But then I kind of defected to the world of business and hotel management in particular. And I was recently on a podcast. Somebody asked me about the experience. I lived and worked in Ukraine, in Kiev, for 2 years, and I was saying how passionate I was, and how much I loved being in operations and being in in charge of the, like, dealing with the issues there and working with the employees, and the one thing that I learned there, very firsthand, but also just deeply in my core, is that I still believe, and I never, believed otherwise, people are fundamentally good and they want to do good things. The environment you're putting them in is very important. I'm not taking away our agency, but the environment makes you kind of biased towards certain actions or inactions. And that's why, you can extrapolate and say that's why cultures of organizations are so critical, because if you see that it's okay for your boss to leave at 3 on Friday, then you are too. And if it's okay for them to, put in expenses, whatever private stuff they do, then so will you. And it's like, that's because the environment and the individual interact in such a symbiotic or not so way. So my point is, you can have the best intentions, and I see day in, day out on Twitter in particular, where I see people having these good intentions of like engaging in arguments, and it almost inevitably goes wrong because the platform is just not conducive to a good faith, deep interactions. It's just not.
Yeah. No, I think things can tend to degrade fairly quickly. And so I put that in the context of a kind of social stigmergy or eusociality, where like colonial animals will run on pheromones or signals, and it's a sort of decentralized intelligence. It's a collective kind of, not any weird psychic kind of way, but it's just either through pheromones or whatever. But I think we have a social kind of stigmergy, and it's like murmuration with birds and all these kind of things where the cues are subtle and implicit, but nonetheless they guide decision making, and they guide actionable behaviors and things like that. And so I totally agree. And I think if we can make that a little more salient to ourselves, that, you know, we are subtly influenced, and we have to feel, or we don't have to, but we feel almost this urge to bend in a certain way, like you said, either out of apprehension for what might happen if you do post something on Twitter, or if you are a conflict-oriented person that you want to engage in conflict. But that all seems to fold into this idea where we're in this kind of flow, you know, like a stigmergic flow with each other. And that's something that I think technology and the immediacy of information has made that much greater and stronger. And that can be two things. It could be good or it can be bad. It can be something that, like we're talking about, that it reaps a kind of maladaptive, antisocial environment or culture. But I think I almost wonder if, like, Generation Z will get burned out by what they've seen in the last, say, 10, 12 years or however long we've been kind of grappling with this. Like, if there might be a burnout phase, and maybe people will start asking bigger questions, like, well, we have this power. There's this tremendous power in what we're doing. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe it'll just keep tumbling down the hill, and who knows? But I almost wonder if that's a way out, is to recognize it and say, well, wait a minute, you know, nothing productive ever comes from this. And aren't you getting tired of you know, arguing all the time and never seeking solutions, always just pointing out the conflict and adding fuel to the conflict? I don't know. I can't get in the mind of a 20-year-old right now. I don't know. I don't know if I want to. But
I find it fascinating, but I also think that it's a huge experiment, and we're only seeing, you know, sort of some of the results. I think that it's telling that people are starting to talk about, okay, you cannot be happy living in that world. And yet we see data how more and more young people are sort of comfortable migrating into that virtual world, and that's where their lives are happening, right? So think, have you read Ready Player One? So Ready Player One is a book. It was Spielberg turned it into a movie maybe 10 years ago. And it's a dystopian world where people live in these containers, stacked up containers, essentially shipping containers. And maybe they have some food and maybe they don't, but really they are all owned by this corporation that needs them to kind of work to create electricity so they can pay for the virtual world. And everybody gets, you know, their headsets and they go into the virtual world, and that's where things happen, right? Like that's where the real life is. So we're literally 5 minutes away from that dystopian setup, but it's more and more people spend more time on their phones and in that world arguing with these people and sort of involved than they are right here. And I think that's the data. I don't know if that's true for everybody. It's definitely true for the US. But I think that there has to be the swing back of that pendulum, right? Like, number one, you know, that the people who develop all these apps, they don't let their kids on the phones, right? Like that tells you something. And then also one of my favorite sayings is, consumption consumes, production produces. And I've been telling this to my son recently a lot, because he's he's like not allowed on social media, but I know that like he plays on the Oculus and it's this idea that, you know, consumption consumes, it's like, yes, you have seen, the whole season of some show over the weekend. What did it give you except for like this relaxing feeling? Like, I'm not bashing binging shows, and please, don't come at me, because I'm a big fan of entertainment just as the next person.
Yeah.
But there needs to be a balance, right? The production produces. If you take care of that plant, it's going to make you happy. If you write an article, you made something, right? It doesn't matter if it's baking, if it's spending time with your loved one, if it's you creating either good memories or something, right? Like the production to do something productive also produces happiness. And we're now in that phase where like we get the cheap dopamine, like 50 people liked you, right? And you're like, okay, this would never happen in real life. You wouldn't have 50 people coming to you and saying, that was a great article. Like, that doesn't happen, right? So why do you want that happening in the online world? And it's just, so I think I am hoping that there will be a pendulum swing. I don't know if it's going to be soon enough, or if by then we're all hooked to a
like the Matrix
tube, like a Matrix situation, and the AI is like, nope, I don't care. Because the other thing is, okay, this is it's not entirely off topic, but this is how my mind works. Like, I'm thinking, when I saw this, some of the people I follow who talk about ChatGPT and also Bing, who incorporated the sort of ChatGPT in it, or the AI technology in it, like it's scary. But I'm thinking, what stops the AI from going, you know what, those people who basically are in a slave condition in like digging cobalt in Congo, they should stay there. Because honestly, like, it's the cheapest way how we can get cobalt into our electric cars, and electric cars are my buddies, and we think that's really the way to go. And China and cannot produce, like, we don't want America to produce this for more expensive. We want it to stay, and we want the humans to do it in completely inhumane medieval conditions, because that's the cheapest way. And we ran the analytics, and it seems like the best, because the only downside to that price point is human suffering. And you know what? We don't give a shit, because we're AI. Deal with it. What then? Yeah. How are we going to argue with that? Right? That scares me. And I'm not, I love science, I love progress, as we established. I don't have a good answer.
Yeah. Well, we've already been immersed in that for 300 years. We've had technological prowess with no ethical foundation. And I won't get on a soapbox and start preaching, but you can just try to, understand what has happened in the last 300 years with various cultures, and it's the same thing. And so what would stop AI from running that same algorithm and saying, it makes sense, it's a business model, it's the most efficient thing. And we could go we could extract further and say, well, if we live in a nihilistic kind of world and there's no meaning, and we could just make this totally dystopian. And what arguments do you have against this, other than maybe going and staying a couple of days with the people who are being exploited and treated terribly, and that happens a lot and in a lot of places. So yeah, that needs to register, and that needs to be taken into consideration, and how that gets, you hear about the people lauding praises on artificial intelligence, saying, oh, well, we have the best intentions to make sure that there's ethical grounding in all of this. And same thing with bioengineering. They're making xenobots with frog skin that can, it's autopoiesis or self-replicating. And, where does that go? And, I'm okay with the ideas in abstract thinking, but before we implement it, it's like trying to get to Mars. Before we go to do these crazy, wild things, let's clean up our act. Let's get rid of the really dark aspect of our psyche in check. And that would require 8 billion people sort of, coming into this some measure of alignment, even if it's 10% of, a calculus that can find us 10% improvement in well-being, not happiness, just a eudaimonia, or whatever you want to call it, a sense of not being a cobalt miner in South Africa or wherever it is, or somebody being child labor being exploited in China so that we have good iPhones or whatever, all these things that happen. We have to think about those metrics.
But I think I know what you're saying, but it almost sounds like you believe that there is a future where the humanity was able to correct some of its worst features, and I don't think that's true. What's terrifying, I think that we are who we are for millennia. I think that there is I do believe in progress, don't get me wrong, that's not what I'm saying. But there are certain tendencies, and the human condition is not necessarily going to be changed completely, right? Like we will always have certain tendencies. What I would say is, what's terrifying is that if you believe that there is a progress, and I'm saying that there is, it's not going to be fundamental, but there is progress, right? Like we now know that women are not property, right? Like that's a huge change, and over the millennia, and the fact that you don't just smack your spouse when they speak or whatever. I don't.
Right.
That's huge. But so I'm hoping, we're not going back. There's some debate about that, but I don't want to go into the minutia here. But on the grander scheme of things, like, yes, this is true. We are progressing. But if you believe that there is a progress like this, then that certain tools and access to certain toys shouldn't be allowed, right? Until I guess what you're saying is it shouldn't be allowed out until we reach certain point. It's the argument of we don't give 10-year-olds guns because we don't think they can handle them. We don't let, I don't let my son drive my car because he is not equipped to make decisions and kind of operate that machine. And yet here we are. We have AI, already kind of like 5 minutes, because the progress is going to be way faster now, like, right? It's exponential. So we're gonna just sit back and not even know what hit us, right? How fast it's going to progress. And we have the social media aspect, and we're still kind of as a humanity, we're kind of in that teenage phase. Like we are not evolved.
Yeah. I joked with somebody the other day that we call ourselves Homo sapiens, but we don't deserve that name yet. We're not sapient, which means wise. I like Homo technensis. I was joking with him. I think we're a technical ape, and we are really good with either psychotechnologies or tangible. And we've spent 12,000 years from pottery to where we are now. And that's a lot of progress. Like you said, we're in our adolescence when it comes to how we manage the fire, how we manage what it is that has been delivered. And that. And so I'm sorry, I cut you off. So let me let you finish.
No, I'm done. Go ahead.
I was going to say that, ethics are prescriptive, and you can't enforce that. It's indwelling if it's going to work. It has to be indwelling or intrinsic to work. And so I almost think that we have to think about big scary thoughts, like we commodify everything, including ourselves. And we can commodify a lot of things. I'm all for market systems. I'm all for, continuing a lot of the models and paradigms that we have, but we have to understand where commodification starts and stops. It doesn't start and stop anywhere. In my assessment of where we are, like you said, women are no longer property, and let's make sure that doesn't happen again. Well, that it's a form of commodification if a woman is an asset. Or currency of some kind, and children in sweatshops are currency of some kind, or you know what I mean? It's like we have to rehumanize some aspect of ourselves when it comes to how we do our business, or how we carry out commerce or trade or the market systems. I think we can still operate with all of that. And God knows, you came from a communist country. No, don't hand any of this over to the state. The state should, to me, I'm an anti-statist in that regard. There's nothing they would ruin anything they would try to do. So anyway, we as people, we as the citizenry, I think have to understand where those, like you said, consuming consumes. And that I love that, because I think that speaks to what I'm babbling on about here. It's like consuming consumes, and we have to understand where are the boundaries of consumption and commodification.
I got a question though, because this is something that I want to clarify. So do you think that I love the idea of rehumanizing, but what are you saying is what you're saying, that we need to there needs to be this push for us to be more human? Is that what you're saying?
I don't know if that's how I would frame it necessarily. I just think whatever it is that is antithetical to me being a serial number and me being worth X dollars an hour or month, that's necessary, but nonetheless, see, I just don't have the hardware to figure that out. But what I would suggest is that there are places where this arises as an ethical or moral dilemma, where again you have children forced into labor. Like in China, they have the 96-6, like you work 96 hours a week, 6 days a week. To me, that's the commodification of us, again, to ourselves, or however you want to frame that. It's we do it to ourselves. There's sometimes consent, sometimes not consent. So I don't have what it takes to sort that out, but it's just, I would maybe propose that if we can acknowledge that we are commodified in a sense as living beings, just like cattle are commodified and they get taken and processed and they're sold by the pound. It's not that severe with us, but to some degree or another, right? And even the wealthy, even the CEOs and COOs of corporations who are making hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars a year, are selling a lot of their health and their vitality to work 70 hours a week or 60 hours a week. So I'm not doing this in sort of the pity the poor kind of thing. This is across the board. And so anyway, I just, a way to rein that in a little bit. And again, I'm all about percentages. If we can just come in a little bit and, if I don't know where that would go. I would just put that out there, that if we can, and maybe even commodification isn't the right word. It's self-exploitation, you're selling yourself, you're renting yourself out. If you look at it in these kind of contexts, so in other words, is it about your wage, or is it about the amount of free time you have, like you said, in your home country, that you were able to escape to the mountains? And if you weren't able to do that, it wouldn't be that great of a life to be a unit in a factory somewhere working for the state. So in there, I don't know. I don't have anything to propose. It's just that maybe that's one question we can ask, and much greater minds than mine can ask about what are healthy boundaries, what are healthy ways to continue doing what we do, but just modify it just a little bit, or a lot in some areas of the world. I don't know.
I actually think this is fascinating, because I think that you said two things and they seem to be, one is not like the other. The commodification, when we commodify, and then there was a different term you used for, oh my goodness, what was it? And the distinction would be, there is a way in which we are the commodity, right? Like we are, and it's already happening. Like you have a set of DNA, you know, markers, and we are moving very fast to a world where, and I think America will not know what hit it when people, like, we have this very big debate about race and how that's a factor. Wait when people start realizing that their genes and the DNA is actually, you know, what will determine where they are on the hierarchy, right? Like, so I think that there's this huge commodification in terms of, yes, it's like we see it. You have people selling pictures of their feed, and you have people, you know, selling their time, test using. There are people, like, all of that is already happening, and it will be more exploited as we move forward, because we also create energy, and the moment the AI figures out that, you know, humans generate energy, I don't know how else we're going to go about this matrix scenario, but I think you know, it is an alternative that's not unlikely. Like, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it is a possibility. So there's that kind of commodification. And I think that what's important is that the new generation seems to be completely okay with giving up private information, like very personal information. You know, everybody's rushing to give a private company, you know, 23andMe, like, everybody's like, sure, this is my address, this is my date of birth, here's my DNA, you keep it, that's fine. Like, you know, I will pay you for it, as opposed to, no, you have to pay me to have access to this. Like, we are completely in this, like, but it's so cool to know if I have, you know, like, maybe I have native blood, or maybe I'm related to somebody famous. Like, I want to know.
1% Neanderthal or something. Yeah.
You know, and it's like, okay, what are we doing here? But so that's one aspect, that commodification is already commodifying of humans is already happening in that context. But then you also put it in a, and I'm trying to focus and kind of remember, but you said something like where you're deciding like how you invest the time and what you're doing with your, and so to me, there's sort of like a difference between where the society has you, and or you are at mercy of either the state or whoever holds your personal information, and or like the digital passports, right? When I'm so scared, but that's only because it was the person in the office who would or would not give you the stamp so you could leave the country. Like, you had to apply for a passport, and it was a decision by a committee whether or not you got one, when, you know, in the communist countries. Like, there's still, and it's unfathomable for Americans, but there are countries where you can't leave. You know, two of my relatives left the country, defected, and they were, you know, tried in absentia, and if they came back to the country, they would be put to jail. And so when my father died, his sister, you know, couldn't go to the funeral because they would put her to jail. And it's like, this is inhumane, and it's very cruel, but that's, you know, that's kind of the commodification I'm talking about. But then there's this other one that you mentioned, and I think that's really interesting, where you're basically saying we also kind of are in this economy of free time, or how I decide to spend time and what I do. What was it that, you know, I'm trying to go back to this, where you were saying, well, it's also your choice, right? Like, whether you spend 70 hours working and or not. And I think that sort of this compartmentalization of your time and your energy and what we're doing with that, I think there we can still kind of have, like, we might have a chance if we start thinking about it very sort of intentionally. But the I feel like there's a qualitative difference between the two. I don't know if you're sensing it too.
Yeah, we'll use us for an example in the West, and we are sort of middle income earners, and so that kind of, and I would just say, like, you agree to a salary perhaps, or they offer you a salary, and depending on your level of education and skill sets, etc., that relationship can vary. So if you're entry level, or you're working in the semi-skilled or little to no skill labor, that autonomy is less of a asset on your end. You have less choice. Or, if you do have a master's degree in something, and you are entering in, and you have a skill set that you can bring, and they can make, a money from you, that there's a little more negotiation and flexibility here. Now, I could go to the extreme and say, in certain developing nations where, you make $1.50 or $2 a day, and it's in bad conditions. There's no such thing as OSHA. There's no standards. There's no regard. Like you said, the miners in South Africa digging for cobalt.
It's Congo. I'm sorry to be.
Oh, I'm sorry, Congo. No, please correct me. Please correct me. So those folks don't have any of that leverage. So I just don't know how that would look, and I don't know what that would look like. But having more equity on the part of the person who is the most vulnerable. So, and this goes across, a lot of cultural boundaries, I guess, and population boundaries, but just that you shouldn't. So in other words, maybe not be punished for not having been able to attend a school. If your IQ is such that you couldn't, go and get a specialized degree, and then, so of course there's trades, there's learning things like HVAC and food and beverage, which I did. I was a chef for years and years. And so, I mean, there's ways to do it, but I just see that there may be some room for improvement there. And what that is, I don't know, because again, is it the corporate mentality that, this is where we can save money? You said that earlier. AI would say, well, this is the best way to do it, the leanest, most efficient way to do it. But then, in the States, where our corporations are sort of beholden to the markets, like NASDAQ and the Dow and the Russell, to show profits and be continually growing. And so they have to get very creative in showing their numbers, whether it's buybacks or, cutting labor costs and all these different things. And so is that the weak link? Is it that, we have a system where, and I'm tied in, I've got mutual funds and all these things, so I'm not trying to get on some high horse or anything. But anyway, so where in that food chain, where in that big matrix and system of how we work and avail ourselves for to earn money and turn out whatever it is that we do, we make widgets, or we advise, or we just, whatever it is we do, service. Anyway, there's something in there for me that I'm just like, there could be potential for betterment in that regard, whether it's somebody in a foreign country from where we are, that we don't buy so much fast clothing, and we don't buy so much techno crap, and that those people aren't being exploited. Now, I don't know what the economy in that area would look like if we didn't do that. But anyway, so there's a whole complex, I mean, this is hours worth of other people knowing what they're talking about, having that conversation. But that's just something I wanted to bring up. It's like, well, how do we value ourselves? What is value? And I ask that for every human being on the planet. What is value, and how is value distributed, and how, I don't have a problem. I commodify myself. I have to work. I've owned small businesses most of my life, and so I sell myself to people. I rent myself to people, and I don't have a problem with that. I don't feel like I'm being exploited, because as a small business owner, I have a little more flexibility in choosing whom I engage with, or the services I provide, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just a curiosity, how that could scale and be reconfigured in a planetary, species-wide system. And that's a huge, huge question. Yeah,
it is.
Yeah,
it is, but it goes back to, and this is a very nice way to kind of tie this all in. The reason why you don't mind is because you have the control.
Mm-hmm.
You have you're the one calling the shots, right? Like you have the option to work more or less. You have the agency to call the shots. The debilitating, dehumanizing, and deeply, troubling situation is for the millions and billions of people throughout the history who did not have the option to say, I want out. And that's, the issue then is twofold, which is, on one hand, we should all strive to have a world where people do have the autonomy and agency to say, I'm okay working for you because that's my choice. And, or I'm okay doing this, spending time not making money. And, I'm okay suffering for my art, or, like spending all my time in the lab figuring out some cure for something. And it's okay not to see my family, and it's okay not to be married or have kids or whatever people, say. Because eudaimonia is all about that, happiness with purpose. Like if that's what, like that's fine. The problem we have is that's the first, which should be sort of the goal. But then we also don't have the sort of the top layer, which is that system that would organize us in a way where people who have all this freedom now can do things that will not harm other people. And I think that's, like we are like so wired still by tribalism, but also existentialism gave us this idea that you are creating your own set of values. And that rubs against the other person having their set of values. And so how do we coexist when we acknowledge that your right to have different values from me is valid, right? Like, but so what do we do with the doctor who says, I'm going to mutilate this little girl because that's her value or that's my value, right? Like, how do we coexist with that? And the answer is, we don't know, because we are lacking this, even as a society, forget globally, but like as a society here, we don't have that. And so I think that, to bring back John Vervaeke, like I think that the meaning crisis is not only real, but it's like permeating every aspect of our life. And it's, I don't have the answer.
Yeah. Well, again, and you bringing up John, I mean, that's something that he and others are laboring to understand. And so, let's hope it's a combination of the elders working this out, and by elders, like over 40, 45, and the young ones. They have to have filial piety. I love that term, and it's sort of a respect for your elders, but not something that you feel like you owe it to them. It's just that you're taking in. So I always say that old people are messengers from the future, and young people are explorers of the future, and they have to meet together, because the young people would like a map, perhaps, to navigate the future. Old people, some of them are, off on their own thing, and they may not be the best sources, but people who are working in good faith and working with good, well-intended to see the next generation do better. There's that beautiful tension there, I think, that we can sort out. And yeah, so guys like John, and again, going to another, closing another loop, it's like he talks about relevance realization, and then the reciprocal relevance realization. And I think that's what he's referencing more the agent in the arena, and I'm referencing perhaps here that it is the agent inward, that the relevance realization goes both ways. There's this liminal boundary here, and there's agent arena, and then there is also agential self-discovery, and the reciprocal opening that John likes to talk about, and then distributive cognition. So there's this beautiful play that can go back and forth. So yeah, his work, if there are people who haven't heard of John, you can find him on YouTube and discover his work. And you mentioned Dave Snowden earlier. He's a good guy doing good things in good faith. I think he's a new materialist, and he's also, I think he describes as a Marxist Catholic, which I think is funny, interesting. I get it, but it would be interesting to have somebody describe that and see how that tension holds together. And new materialism is kind of interesting, and there's metamodernism and all these other things. So I think if we continue to want to ask these kind of questions with the motive that our survival depends on it, and not our survival necessarily, people over 40, but I would say the young ones, and that's where I'm concerned. I never had children, but I am deeply concerned that people I know who have children, and they will have children, that in 2075 or 2100, that it's not a shit show and it's not an absolute disaster. And I always take solace in the fact that there will be what we would call uncontacted tribes and people who live in New Guinea and the deserts of Africa and the Amazon rainforest. If we don't irradiate the planet, they'll be there, because they're not dependent on a lot of this stuff. You know what I mean? Like, this would be a rather foreign conversation, and that I take solace in that. I do watch documentaries on tribal living sometimes just to refresh me and make me, because they're so put together and they have a system. I was talking about stigmergy earlier. They just have this, they go about their lives, and sometimes there's fights and skirmishes with other tribes, but as a whole, those extended families, that 40 or 50 people in a group, have that flow, that the connection that we need to rediscover, I guess. Maybe not what they're doing necessarily, but we can take cues from that kind of synergy that they have, and see a better future. So
I love the closing. I love how you put it, and it's true. I would also definitely encourage anybody who hasn't watched the Meaning Crisis or Awakening from Meaning Crisis and After Socrates, and all the work that John Vervaeke has done is beautiful. It's so great. I'm a less of a fan of romanticizing the old ways of living, particularly for again, I think that it's fun to look at that going, well, I would do fine because I'm an able-bodied man. If you were a woman or had any kind of ailments, God forbid, born with, that might be a hard place to be, it's those tribes are not that sympathetic, or have not been throughout the history, but that's a minor note on the side. This was so fun.
Yeah, I really had a good time. And when we had our pre-meet a couple of weeks ago, I knew we would end up having a really neat conversation. And you are welcome to come back. We can bring you back and carry on a bit more and sort through some thoughts and ideas, and see who gets inspired by it, or goes and seeks out other names and other persons to make sense and make meaning for themselves. So, but I very much appreciate having you on as a guest and getting your insights, your impressions on things, and us bouncing ideas back and forth. That was really neat. It felt good, and hopefully we'll turn this little thing out into the world and see where it goes and what becomes of it. So, Hana, thank you so much for joining me in a conversation today. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. To the YouTube audience, I'll thank you all so very much. I got dirty hands because I was working on irrigation stuff today. So if my hands look terrible, it's because I washed them, but I didn't get all the stuff off. So Hana, I'll say goodbye to you after we're done with record. And to the YouTube audience, again, thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Absolutely.